Rain slithered down the rusted edges of the garage door, tapping like impatient fingers as Mia leaned over the open hood of an old sedan she'd been working on for 2 hours longer than she'd planned. Her shoulders ached, her hair was frizzing from the humidity, and her mind was racing with 100 tiny worries. Whether Emma had finished her homework, whether she'd remembered to pay the electricity bill, whether the shop rent would bounce again. She told herself she'd close after this job, lock the door, pick up her daughter, and maybe give herself 5 quiet minutes to breathe. But the universe, as usual, had different plans. The squeal of tires cut through the rain, followed by the low, polished purr of an engine she recognized instantly. Not because she ever worked on cars like that, but because you didn't need to be wealthy to know the sound of a Rolls-Royce. Her hands froze. The sedan's hood looked suddenly pathetic compared to the gleaming shadow rolling toward her garage. The car stopped inches from the faded yellow parking line. The door opened with a soft, expensive click. And out stepped a man who looked like he belonged everywhere except in her world. Tall, sharply built, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, he scanned the garage like he was stepping onto foreign ground. His jaw clenched once, a flicker of irritation, not at the place, but at the situation, crossing his face. Mia lifted her chin, wiping her hands on her rag as he approached, each of his polished shoes making her floor look dirtier. He didn't seem to notice, his attention was fixed on his car. The engine light came on again, he said, voice tight, clipped, as if he wasn't used to things malfunctioning around him. Or people disappointing him. You serviced it last week. Mia resisted the urge to defend herself. Rolls-Royces were a different beast, and she only took the job because the previous shop messed something up so badly that the man had run out of places to go. He didn't trust anyone, but he'd risked trusting her. Now, it seemed, he wasn't thrilled about it. Pop the hood, she said simply. He pressed the button inside the cabin, and the hood rose like the wings of something majestic and temperamental. Mia stepped forward, expecting to feel intimidated, but the moment she looked inside, her mind shifted into its familiar rhythm. Wires, belts, fluid lines, the soothing logic of engines that always made more sense than people. She leaned closer, frowning. Something was off, but she needed a few minutes to trace it. She felt the man's presence beside her. Not intrusive, just sharp, focused, observant. She could practically feel his impatience humming in the air, but he didn't say a word. Good. She didn't need commentary. What she didn't expect was the sudden stillness. It wasn't from the engine. It was from him. She straightened, brushing her hair from her face, and found his gaze, not on the car, but on her hand. No, not even her hand. Her ring. The thin, worn silver band, scratched at the edges, the only piece of jewelry she owned that held any meaning. She forgot it was even there most days. But he didn't. His eyes lingered on it with a mix of confusion and something else she couldn't decipher. You're married? He asked, and his voice didn't sound like a man making conversation. It sounded like a man trying to fit a puzzle piece into a picture he'd already started forming in his mind. Heat crept up her neck. She didn't know why the question felt so personal coming from him, why it made the air feel tighter, or why the rain suddenly seemed louder against the metal roof. She opened her mouth to answer, but her voice caught for a moment she couldn't explain. Mia worked in silence, the hum of rain on. The roof blending with the occasional metallic clink of her tools as she moved around the massive engine. She could feel him behind her, not hovering, but present in a way she wasn't used to from customers. Billionaires weren't supposed to wait. They certainly weren't supposed to stand in a dim, oil-scented garage with their hands in their pockets like ordinary men. But Ethan Cross stayed. He paced once, twice, then stopped completely, watching her with a kind of restless intensity that made the back of her neck prickle. She kept her focus on the machinery, tracing through the electrical system, tightening a few connections, studying the diagnostic screen glowing faintly beside her. She'd seen this issue before. On cheaper cars, easier engines, but luxury machines were finicky, sensitive, prone to inventing new ways to break down. Still, this one was fixable, and she was determined to prove that her small garage wasn't beneath a car worth more than her building. She slid under the hood, the beam of her small, battered work light slicing through the shadows. But just as she was tightening a bolt, a sudden echoing tap of little boots made her freeze. The door to the office swung open. Mom. Mia's heart jumped. Emma, in her bright unicorn raincoat, ran across the concrete floor, her tiny footsteps splashing through small puddles left by the leaking roof. Mia had told her daughter, firmly, to stay inside, watch her cartoons, and wait. But thunder cracked outside, loud enough to make the windows tremble. And when Emma was scared, she always looked for Mia. Always. Mia pushed herself from beneath the hood and barely had time to open her arms before Emma collided with her, burying her face into her mother's chest. Her little shoulders shook, a soft, frightened sniffle escaped her. "I know, baby," Mia whispered, smoothing her hand over Emma's hair. "It's just the storm. Mommy's right here." She felt Ethan's presence shift behind her, the energy in the room softening. She looked over her shoulder and found him completely still, his expression no longer annoyed or impatient. Instead, he looked, startled. Moved. As if this tiny girl in a raincoat had reached inside his perfectly controlled world and tugged at something he didn't know how to protect. "She's your daughter?" he asked, and the question left him in a low, almost reverent tone. Mia nodded, embarrassed, suddenly aware of how messy her life must look to a man whose shoes probably cost more than her whole outfit. Single mom. Stormy evening. A child running into the garage. There was no polished version of her life to show him, just reality. But Ethan didn't step back or glance at his watch. He didn't look frustrated at the interruption. His eyes softened, tracing the gentle way she held her daughter, the tired lines around her eyes, the strength she carried in the curve of her shoulders. Then his gaze lowered again, almost without his permission, drifting to the ring on her finger. The tarnished silver glinted under the garage lights, and something unreadable passed through his eyes, not jealousy, not judgment, but a kind of mourning. "Your husband must be proud," he said quietly, as if the words came from someplace honest. Mia froze, her fingers tightening around Emma's rain-soaked coat. She didn't know why, but the simple sentence hit something deep inside her, something she wasn't ready for anyone, especially a stranger like him, to touch. When Emma finally calmed enough for Mia to guide her back to the office with a quick kiss to the forehead and a reminder to stay where it was warm, Mia turned back to the hood of the Rolls-Royce. She expected Ethan to resume pacing, to check his watch, to return to the crisp impatience she had seen earlier. But he didn't move. He stood exactly where she'd left him, one hand braced lightly against the workbench as if steadying himself. His gaze followed her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her painfully aware of every breath she took. She reached for her tools again, hoping the familiar rhythm of bolts, wires, and diagnostics would quiet the strange tension threading through the air. She didn't get that chance. Ethan stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. "Earlier," he said, voice low, "I noticed your ring." Mia's hand paused mid-reach. She didn't turn to face him yet. "Most people do," she murmured. "They assume a lot of things." "I didn't assume," Ethan replied. "I just wondered." She swallowed. Wondered. Such a simple word, yet it felt heavier coming from him. She finally lifted her gaze to meet his. His expression wasn't intrusive or nosy. There was no pity, no judgment. Just intent curiosity, and something gentler beneath it, something that made her chest tighten. "You didn't mention your husband," he continued, each word measured. "So I wasn't sure if he," his voice trailed off, as though he realized he was crossing into ground he had no right to tread. But Mia wasn't angry. Strangely, she felt something else entirely, something close to relief. Like someone had finally asked a question she had grown too tired to answer on her own. "He passed away," she said softly, her fingers curling around the edge of the car for balance. The words always tasted bittersweet, even now. 3 years ago. Ethan's breath seemed to catch. He didn't offer empty condolences. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He simply stood there, still and open, letting the truth settle in the quiet space between them. Rain thundered against the roof. Somewhere in the office, Emma hummed a tune from her cartoon. The world outside the garage kept moving, loud and uncaring, but inside, everything felt suspended. "I'm sorry," he finally said, but the way he said it made her look up again. It wasn't the automatic apology people gave when they didn't know what else to say. It was slow, sincere, heavy with a respect she hadn't expected from a man wrapped in wealth and power. She nodded once, trying to pull herself back into work mode, bending over the engine again. But Ethan still didn't leave. He stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against her shoulder. He picked up a flashlight from the workbench without being asked, holding it steady, angling the beam exactly where she needed it. She paused. No one ever did that. Not since her husband. Customers usually hovered with annoyance, or lectured her, or doubted her skills. But Ethan stood quietly, without ego, without commentary, without pretending to understand engines. He was just helping. You do all this alone? He asked after a moment, his voice so gentle she almost didn't recognize it coming from the same man who had stormed in earlier. Mia gave a hollow half-laugh. Yeah, life doesn't give me another option. Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened just slightly, his jaw shifting with a subtle, frustrated ache, not at her, she realized, but at the idea of someone like her having to struggle so hard. Maybe, he murmured, life should start giving you some options. The words struck her far deeper than she expected, echoing inside her long after the light moved back to the engine and the rain kept pouring against the roof. By the time Mia tightened the last bolt and lowered the hood with a soft, satisfying click, the storm had eased into a steady drizzle, the kind that turned the world soft and silver. The engine beneath the metal purred perfectly, smooth as velvet, a sound even she had to admit was worth the reputation of the brand. She stepped back, wiping her hands on her rag, bracing herself for the usual routine. Customer signs the receipt, pays, leaves, end of story. But Ethan didn't move toward the car. He didn't even glance at it. His attention stayed on her, as though the repaired Rolls-Royce was the least important part of why he had come. Mia felt her throat tighten. She wasn't used to being looked at like that, not with that mix of gentleness, curiosity, and something deeper she didn't dare name. It's done, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. You won't have trouble with it again. The issue started with the previous shop's wiring. I fixed it. Ethan's jaw relaxed, a slow breath leaving him. But instead of relief, something like hesitation crossed his eyes, as if he was searching for words he wasn't sure he had the right to say. I believe you, he murmured. She blinked. Most wealthy customers needed proof, paperwork, explanation. He didn't need any, he trusted her work more than she trusted herself some days. He stepped closer, closing the space between them with a quiet confidence that made her heart trip. She could smell the faint scent of rain on his suit, something clean and expensive. He looked down at her hands, not by accident, not casually. Purposefully. And his gaze stopped exactly where she knew it would, the small silver ring resting against her oil-streaked skin. His hand lifted slightly, as if drawn toward hers, but he didn't touch her. He hovered just close enough that she felt the warmth of him. This ring, he said softly, you wear it because you still love him. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was something else, a careful understanding, spoken with more care than she expected from anyone, let alone a stranger who walked in with $1 million car. Mia swallowed, her voice barely steady. Yes. A simple word, but her chest ached as she said it. Ethan nodded once, slowly, a crease forming between his brows, not from frustration, but from something like admiration. Respect. Maybe even longing. I respect that, he whispered, his voice dipping lower, carrying something honest, unpolished, vulnerable. The kind of tone that couldn't be faked. The kind that made her breath catch. He withdrew his hand, letting it fall to his side, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. He didn't smile, didn't flirt, didn't step back, he just held her there in the quiet, like he was memorizing her face in the half-light. Then, with a slow exhale, he added, but if the day ever comes when you decide to take it off, even for a moment, he paused, swallowing. I would like to be the first to know. The words wrapped around her, warm and dangerous, settling somewhere she hadn't let herself feel in years. She didn't answer, couldn't, because anything she said would betray how unsteady her heartbeat had become. Ethan stepped back at last, opening the Rolls-Royce door with a soft click, never breaking their gaze until the very last second. The engine started, low and smooth, but Mia barely heard it. She stood at the entrance of the garage, rain misting against her skin, watching the taillights disappear into the wet evening while her ring, felt heavier than it had in a very long time.